Republicans lost big in the recent off-year elections in Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. Given the disastrous and unpopular presidency of Joe Biden, being a Democrat isn't exactly a badge of honor right now, so the losses were something of a surprise. Many moderate, preemptive surrender RINO Republicans are doing what they always do and blaming the losses on the issue of abortion. But even a cursory look at the facts shows that the losses weren't the result of Republicans running on the abortion issue. On the contrary, Republicans lost because they refused to fight on the abortion issue at all, waving the white flag before the battle was even joined. It's time for Republicans to grow a spine, lean into the culture war, present a bold vision based on life and freedom and American greatness, and aggressively call out the extremism and the lies of the radical left death cult that is the Democrat Party. It's the only way to win elections and save our country. Then, in our deep dive segment, I examine the state of Israel's war against the evil that is Hamas and calls coming from the radical left pro-Palestinian crowd for a ceasefire. No ceasefire may be granted. We can't do that. Hamas is on the ropes. They need a ceasefire to survive. It is imperative that they be destroyed. The United States must denounce all those who call for a ceasefire. All that plus behind the headlines on this week's episode of Founding Principles. As always, I'm your host, Doug Wardlow.
A battle for the fate of America rages. The radical left seeks to destroy the very foundations of our republic. God, the family, and the Constitution are under attack. Amidst the chaos, Doug Wardlow speaks truth and points the way back to freedom. It is time to go on offense. This is Founding Principles with Doug Wardlow.
As you are no doubt aware, last week's off-year elections were by and large a disaster for Republicans. In Kentucky, Republican challenger Daniel Cameron lost to the Democrat incumbent Andy Beshear. The race was pretty close. Cameron lost by only 67,000 votes, or about 5 points. At the same time, however, the Republican candidate for Secretary of State, Michael Adams, won his race by 21 points. The Republican candidate running to replace Daniel Cameron in the Attorney General's office, Russell Coleman, won his race by 16 points. In light of those down-ballot results, Cameron's 5-point loss to Beshear is somewhat surprising and a significant disappointment for Republicans. Meanwhile, in Virginia, control of the Virginia Senate and House of Delegates were up for grabs. Republicans had high hopes that we could flip the state Senate and keep our hold in the state House. Certainly the national political climate should favor Republicans. Joe Biden's 3 years in the White House have brought us massive inflation, rising violent crime in our major cities, the entry of 4 million illegal immigrants together with huge quantities of fentanyl and unchecked human trafficking across our southern border, skyrocketing federal debt, and emboldened Hamas and an emboldened Iran who worked together to perpetrate the largest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust and the largest war in Europe since World War II. With such a terrible and unpopular Democrat president, Democrat candidates in Virginia and all over the country should have had a very uphill road to climb. But Democrats maintained their control of Virginia Senate, and they won enough seats to flip control of the House. Then, in Ohio, a constitutional amendment to create a right to abortion passed by a margin of 10 points, 56 to 43%. It was a terrible blow to the pro-life cause. So, what happened? Well, many moderate Republicans and even some supposed conservatives are blaming all the election losses on a single issue, abortion. They are completely wrong. Even so, many Republican pundits and members of the consultant class are already counseling candidates to steer clear of the abortion issue entirely, which is basically surrendering on the pro-life cause. Of course, there is nothing new about that. Moderate Republicans have been telling candidates to steer clear of the abortion issue for decades. Most Republicans, unfortunately, have followed this bad advice, including most, if not all, of the Republican candidates who lost on Tuesday night. Certainly, I'm not aware of a single candidate who put forward a bold, aggressive message on the pro-life issue, and I'm not aware of a single candidate who ran ads calling out the Democrats for their extreme abortion up to the moment of birth positions. And so Republicans never really engaged in a sufficiently meaningful and aggressive way on the pro-life issue to warrant the conclusion that Republicans lost because of the abortion issue. It would be more accurate to say that some Republicans lost because they refused to fight for the pro-life cause in the face of unrelenting Democrat messaging on that very issue. You see, the pro-life cause can be and should be a winning issue for Republicans if they actually go on the offense and fight. An issue in and of itself isn't a winning or a losing issue. What makes an issue a winning or a losing issue is how you message it and whether you can put forward a compelling vision with regard to it, a vision that can win over hearts and minds. It is ridiculous to say that Republicans lost because of the abortion issue when Republican candidates have been running away from the pro-life cause, refusing to even make the arguments or pay to run the kind of ads needed to win the issue. The Democrats, meanwhile, have been spending inordinate amounts of money to advance their lies about abortion. According to Ad Impact, a media tracking firm through NBC News, Democrats have spent more than $74 million on ads about abortion in 2023, compared with just $16 million for Republicans. In Virginia, Democrats spent 10 times more money on ads related to abortion than Republicans. And in the Kentucky governor's race, Democrats spent $1.3 million on abortion-related ads since September. But Republicans failed to air one single pro-life ad since August, not even one. Regardless of what issue you are talking about, if the Democrats spend millions upon millions on ads to spread lies and instigate fear in the public, and Republicans don't do anything in response, instead just burying their heads in the sand and pretending nothing is happening, well, then Republicans are going to lose. That's what happened in the recent elections. So the election results just don't justify the conclusion that abortion is a losing issue for Republicans, not at all. Instead, the results merely demonstrate the obvious. Republicans lose when they refuse to fight. And yet some Republicans are now saying that we basically need to just give up on the pro-life cause in order to win elections. That is completely backwards and wrong-headed. Do they think the Democrats will just stop attacking Republicans on abortion? No, they won't. No matter how much a Republican candidate tries to get distance from the pro-life cause, Democrats will still run ads claiming that Republicans want to take away so-called reproductive rights. You can't win a battle by laying down your arms and hoping your opposition will just stop attacking you. The Democrats are fighting for a culture of death, and they will not declare a truce, ever. The losses in the recent elections mirror what happened here in my home state of Minnesota in the 2022 midterm elections 1 year ago, when the Minnesota Republican Party issued a memo to all statewide candidates urging them to essentially stand down on the abortion issue. More specifically, the memo advised that candidates should answer any questions about abortion with the following recommended statement. Here's what the statement said, quote, "Here are the facts. Abortion up to the moment of birth is a constitutional protected right in Minnesota. The only two ways this can be changed are by the Minnesota Supreme Court overturning the existing law or by Minnesota voters passing a state referendum. Since abortion is not on the ballot, let's talk about the ongoing issues that affect Minnesotans every day: crime, inflation, the economy, and education." Close quote. I mean, you've got to be kidding me. When I saw this leaked memo, I frankly thought it was a joke, but unfortunately it was not. I was angry, of course, because here you have the state Republican Party telling candidates not to engage in the culture war, and to do that by acknowledging a state constitutional right to abortion up to the moment of birth. Now, the Minnesota Supreme Court did incorrectly rule in a terrible case called Doe versus Gomez that abortion is protected by the Minnesota Constitution. But that ruling is wrong, just like Roe versus Wade was wrong. It is wrong for reasons that mirror the reasons explained by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Dobbs case. There is nothing at all about abortion in the Minnesota Constitution, and the matter must be left to the legislature to regulate. The pro-life movement in Minnesota is working to get that terrible ruling overturned, and the Republican Party threw the pro-life movement right under the bus, right after the Dobbs decision came down. It's terrible. But here's the political problem with that memo. You can't win an election by standing down when the opposition attacks you on a significant issue. And you can't win an election by accepting the opponent's frame of argument on a significant issue either. That should be obvious, even to a child, but apparently that thought never crossed the brilliant minds at work at the Minnesota Republican Party, because that's exactly what they did. They told statewide candidates to expressly accept the Democrats' premise that abortion is a state constitutional right. But as soon as you do that, you are implying that abortion is something worthy of protection. You are implying that abortion rights are good and should be protected. That's what this recommended statement from the state party did. It put our Republican candidates, who followed the terrible advice, in a position where they had to be on the defense on abortion, having accepted the premise that abortion rights should be protected. And when you are on the defense, you are losing. And we saw this play out in the Minnesota campaigns. Democrats, of course, attacked Republicans, saying that Republicans would gut abortion rights, just as happened in elections last week. Instead of pushing back by arguing that life is precious and then talking about how extreme the Democrats are, they want anyone to be able to kill a baby right after the moment of birth, and maybe after birth some cases. Instead of fighting back like that and then perhaps pivoting to how Democrats' disrespect for life extends to the victims of murderers and other criminals terrorizing our cities, Minnesota Republicans were advised to just say basically, no, don't worry about your abortion rights. If I'm elected, you'll still be able to kill babies, and there isn't anything we Republicans can do about it, nor would we want to. Well, this set back the pro-life cause in Minnesota. It threw pro-life activists under the bus, and it didn't work as an election strategy. All the Republican statewide candidates lost, and Democrats took over full control of Minnesota state government. It should have been no surprise to anyone that the state party's abortion strategy failed. There is no way it could have possibly succeeded. What, did they think that Democrat media and the Democrat Party would hear Republicans say that they don't intend to do anything to stop baby killing, and then the Democrats and the media would just take Republicans' word on the matter and move on to something else? That they would just stop attacking Republicans on the abortion issue? Of course they wouldn't do that. But also consider this. What did the public hear? How did this sound to the average voter? The voters heard Republican candidates talking about life in the primary phase of the election, and then, during the last few months of the campaign, suddenly cartwheeling backwards in fear at the mere mention of abortion. accepting the idea that abortion rights are a constitutionally protected good and sounding pseudo-pro-choice. In other words, they hear inauthentic wishy-washiness. And the pro-life voters heard Republicans betraying the pro-life cause. Neither of those things is a formula for success. Those things are a formula for electoral defeat. But let's assume for the sake of argument only that the moderate Republican consultant class is right, and that standing up for the cause of life means losing every election going forward. Well, even if that were true, we would still need to stand up and fight for life, because we're talking here about opposing the slaughter of children. There is no more fundamental an issue than the value of innocent human life. But the good news is that Republicans can win elections on the issue of abortion. We must fight to create a culture of life, and we can win elections by doing it. But how? Well, it starts by not laying down our arms and surrendering. Well, that's the obvious first step. We need Republican groups and candidates to spend significant money on ads that rip into the Democrats for their extreme views on abortion, ads that call out Democrats for supporting abortion right up to the moment of birth, ads that detail just how gruesome a third trimester abortion really is, ads that celebrate children and life, ads that make it clear that there are positive alternatives to abortion, ads that make it very clear just how traumatic an experience an abortion is for the mother, scarring her for her entire life. Candidates' messaging needs to match those ads. Democrats are extreme. Democrats are okay with killing children in the womb right up to the moment of birth. Democrats oppose children. Democrats oppose a culture of life. Democrats don't care about the psychological scars that abortion inflicts on women. Then we also need strong messaging on the alternatives to abortion. We need to make it clear that Republicans care about expectant mothers who find themselves in difficult situations. We need to talk about increasing funding for crisis pregnancy centers and pregnancy resource centers, for positive alternatives programs, for adoption. Republicans care about kids and moms. Democrats just want to bring in profits for the child murder industry. Aggressive, candid messaging, both negative messaging and positive messaging, together with significant financial backing to get the ads out on their airwaves and on social media and the internet. With all of that, Republicans can score huge victories for the pro-life cause and win elections. The same lessons extend to all the other important issues as well. In general, Republicans need to be aggressive on all fronts, drawing clear contrasts with Democrats, casting a positive vision across multiple issues while calling out the Democrats for their anti-life, anti-freedom, anti-prosperity agenda. By and large, the Republicans who lost races in the recent elections didn't do that. Running the same old tired campaigns, talking about issues that are deemed safe, while Democrats pummel Republicans on issues that Republicans deem unsafe, like abortion, well, that's a recipe for electoral disaster. Fortunately, in 2024, we'll have a presidential nominee in Donald Trump who knows how to put forward a vision of American greatness that resonates with Americans and also knows how to call out the radical left as well as the leftist-controlled media. Let's hope that Republicans up and down the ballot follow his lead and take the fight aggressively to the Democrats. Well, if you like the content that we're providing, please go ahead and like the video, subscribe to our channels on Rumble and on YouTube. If you're watching on Frank's Speech, Lindell TV, thank you. Keep tuning in every Saturday and Sunday at 6 p.m. You can watch the show live there, and thanks for supporting the show. Also, go to mypillow.com and use promo code WARDLOW, that's WARDLOW, to get discounts on all their fine products. That's mypillow.com, promo code WARDLOW. And now it's time for Behind the Headlines. First up today, conservative commentator Steven Crowder recently released part of the Covenant School Shooters Manifesto, which he obtained through an investigative reporter. The memo, part of it at least, what was leaked. When a tragedy like the Covenant school shooting occurs, it's usually the police, right, who immediately tell the public the reasons that the deranged lunatic gave for committing the heinous crime. Well, that did not happen here. But we all know why it didn't happen, I think. In fact, we knew from the start, really, what was in this manifesto, even though we never saw it. We had strong suspicions. The shooter was immediately identified early on as a transgender identifying person. You see, so the shooter didn't match the leftist media's desired narrative. And, not surprisingly, it turns out the manifesto is filled with vile anti-white and anti-Christian bigotry. The racism against whites and the bigotry against Christians is apparent in the partial document leaked to Steven Crowder. And remember, we still don't have the full manifesto, so I'm sure there's a lot more leftist nonsense in the part that we don't have. One thing is clear from the part that we do have, however: the left's racist, anti-white, anti-Christian rhetoric, well, it's dangerous and it is deadly. Now, this isn't some hypothetical words are violent situation, like snowflakes complain about on college campuses. Gender-confused people often claim that refusing to affirm their delusions is akin to violence, but that's simply not true, of course. Refusing to affirm something that is not true is to stand up for the truth. It's the most caring thing you can do when confronted with someone who suffers from gender confusion. You don't want to just let them go on in their confusion and their delusions. That would be unsympathetic. That would be uncaring. Here, the leftist media and the people who don't want Americans to understand the anti-Christian and racist motives of the shooter, together with the radical leftists in higher education and throughout popular culture, well, they are propagandizing and radicalizing people, especially young people, to hate people that they claim are so-called colonizers, the Christians, the Jews, the white people. It's very dangerous, and we must call it out now. We need to fight cultural Marxism and the dangerous, incorrect, ridiculous, illogical philosophy of decolonization. The left is wrong on every issue. Their worldview and policy prescriptions don't work in theory, and they don't work in practice. Leftism has failed, but the leftist's goal has been from the beginning to brainwash people and warp their minds to steep them in ideology. So they don't believe the reality that they perceive with their senses, but rather twist that reality to fit their ideology. You see, leftism is an ideology. It's all about ideology. It's all about forcing a particular way of thinking, a strict and rigid way of thinking onto the facts around you, rather than conservatism is not ideological. Conservatism is just trying to preserve things, trying to preserve American greatness, trying to preserve our founding principles, trying to preserve the traditions and our Judeo-Christian values and the traditions that led to those values, trying to preserve the traditions that started in Jerusalem and went to Athens and then to Rome and then to London and then to Washington, D.C., trying to preserve the West. That's not an ideology. That you assess facts on the ground in reality, you accept reality, and then you move forward accordingly. But leftism is an ideology where you try to force the world to fit the contours of that ideology. And that is the project of the left. They brainwash citizens of our major cities, for example, so they don't even see the decay and the rot around them. They brainwash people so that they see good and decent people as the enemy. The anti-American leftists running our institutions of higher education, as well as the Democrat Party, are pushing ideology to teach people to hate you, to hate America, to hate Christianity, and to hate the West. According to their ideology, regardless of reality, you are the cause of pain and suffering around them, and so then they are justified in their minds in doing evil. Well, enough is enough. It's time to stamp out racism and anti-Christian bigotry and anti-Semitism. The fight starts by gutting our system of higher education, going after schools' endowments, deporting foreign students who espouse support for terrorist groups like Hamas, and suing schools that create a hostile environment that discriminates on the basis of race. We can sue them using Title VI, and we can sue them using state anti-discrimination laws as well. Even as we fight this important fight, we know that in the end, we will be victorious because God makes all things right. In the end, He will judge, and He will judge perfectly. We don't have to worry about our ultimate judgment because God is in control. But let's stop evil from happening when and where we can. So stand up for our Judeo-Christian values, stand up for your faith, stand up for Christianity, stand up for the West, and stand up for our nation. All right. Second today, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is retiring. This is wonderful news because it takes a tilt Democrat seat in West Virginia, Senate seat, and makes it a likely Republican seat because West Virginia is very red country. This is indeed excellent because we have many seats in the 2024 election that we can pick up, all but assuring majority in 2024 if we fight hard. This doesn't mean we can be complacent or take anything for granted, of course. No. Now we must up the ante. We must up the ante and put pressure on the Democrats and get as many wins as possible. With the focus off of West Virginia, though, we can win in other states and shift resources, Montana, Ohio, Arizona. Who knows how far we can expand our map now that resources can be diverted from West Virginia to elsewhere. Joe Manchin has become known as a moderate. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but let's just say for the sake of argument that he is a moderate. It's true, he hasn't gone along with the idiotic plans to get rid of the filibuster or expand the Supreme Court, but he's still voted with his caucus to pass a lot of damaging things. So this is a pickup for Republicans in our quest to take both chambers of Congress, and the presidency is looking quite good right now, but it's going to take a lot of work. We need to run bold conservative candidates and take nothing for granted. It's become apparent that we need leadership changes within our party. We need leaders that can present a bold vision and message on all the important issues aggressively while knowing where to spend our time and resources. Our leaders have failed us, and they insist on running insider candidates who don't believe in conservative principles, candidates that want to just compromise on things like the pro-life cause, for example. They've wasted money and cost us victories for the sake of their donors. Enough is enough. Making America great again is essential. Our country is in deep trouble, but we can be a shining city on the hill once again. But it will require undoing the radical transformation that Obama and Biden have brought us. All right, third and finally for Behind the Headlines today, Danica Roem is set to become Virginia's first so-called transgender state senator. Well, this really shows you how far our nation has fallen. To be a woman means something very significant. To be a man means something very significant as well. Being a woman or a man is not just a matter of hair length or makeup or the clothes one wears. God makes our body and our soul into a man or a woman. He has given us specific roles and duties that are noble and necessary for a flourishing society. Human pride telling us we can just magically switch genders because it's all on a spectrum isn't just wrong, it's an insult to God's creation. It's worship of the self, and it's a rejection of God's sovereignty. But Virginia has decided that this delusional person shouldn't only be parading around in women face, this guy should also be writing state laws. It's fascinating, isn't it? Maybe they should elect a child who believes they are a dinosaur to the state house while they are at it, just to make sure we have good representation. In another state legislative race, Virginia voters decided not to elect a woman who was found to have videotaped sexual acts and posted them online for money. But what's truly shocking is that she lost by less than 3%. Apparently, almost 50% of her would-be constituents thought that an unrepentant and unreformed porn star could and should become a public servant vested with the power to make laws. Our country is eroding in part because we refuse to enforce good ethical standards. Elected office is a privilege, and the people's representatives should be examples of good ethical and moral character. Everyone should have the chance for forgiveness and redemption. Everyone should be encouraged to live better in accordance with God's will. But maybe, just maybe, we collectively should decide not to put unrepentant porn stars and delusional men dressing as women into elected office. Just a thought. Israel is winning in Gaza. Israel has killed several Hamas leaders, thousands of Hamas fighters, and is uncovering and destroying Hamas's vast 500-kilometer network of underground tunnels. And right on cue, radical leftist madmen the world over are losing their minds, scrambling to do whatever they can to save their terrorist allies. They want a so-called humanitarian ceasefire to protect all the innocent Gazan civilians. At least that's what they say on television. The real reason has more to do with aiding Hamas and furthering Hamas's terrible goal of creating a Jew-free Palestine from the river to the sea. In other words, their goal is genocide and the destruction of Israel. And while President Biden hasn't called for an outright ceasefire, there are signs that he is moving in that very regrettable direction. Under no circumstances can the United States allow the UN or any other government or organization to impose a ceasefire on Israel. A ceasefire will benefit Hamas and allow the existential threat to Israel and to all freedom-loving people to fester and grow. Rather, the United States should be doing everything it can to counter any and all efforts to constrain the Israelis as they work to rid the world of the infestation of terror and evil that is Hamas. We have all seen the pro-Palestinian protests breaking out on college campuses here in the United States. We have all heard the pro-Palestinian rhetoric coming from radical left Democrats, especially the various squad members. But this last weekend, things took another turn when thousands of demonstrators carrying signs in support of Hamas and demanding to free Palestine descended on the White House. They chanted in support of a ceasefire and an end to so-called Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. They defaced the White House gate and ran around acting as if the Israelis were the ones who launched a savage surprise terror attack on the people in Gaza. I guess they didn't hear about the beheading of babies, the people burned alive, and the fact that Hamas didn't have any military targets. Hamas only targeted innocent civilians, including women, children, and babies. It appears that the pro-Palestinian protesters see all the people within Israel as legitimate targets and have no problem with operations specifically designed to kill only civilians, because that is what happened on October 7th. Yes, some Israeli military personnel were killed, but once the Hamas terrorists got past the border guard, they went exclusively for civilians, as did the throngs of supposedly innocent Gazan civilians that followed them in and joined in the killing. 1,500 Israelis lost their lives in the most despicable, evil, atrocious barbarities seen since the Holocaust. But when Israel fights back, they are immediately branded as war criminals when they attack military targets and have some collateral damage. According to the radical pro-Palestinian crowd, the Israelis are supposed to just sit back and take it until they are weak enough for the Arabs to invade them once again, and this time just maybe the disgusting pro-Palestinian anti-Semites hope the Arab armies will push them into the sea. That is what Hamas, the Palestinians, and those who support them want. As I mentioned last week, the Arabs and their Palestinians and pro-Palestinians have been offered a two-state solution on 5 different occasions, and they rejected it every single time. Why? Because they will not accept Israel's right to exist. Maybe that is why so many who support the Palestinians look past the brutal, inhuman behavior from Hamas and their ilk. Make no mistake, anyone who is supporting the Palestinians right now and is not calling for the destruction of Hamas is giving the okay to their savage terror attack and the green light to do it again. How many pro-Palestinian protesters have you heard call for Hamas to be removed, disbanded, or destroyed? The answer is none. That is because the line between the Palestinians, especially the Palestinians living in Gaza, and Hamas is blurred at best. Don't forget that the Palestinians in Gaza elected Hamas to serve as their political leadership. They elected the terrorists who now use them as human shields. Just a few days ago, one day after U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken visited the West Bank to meet with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, there was an assassination attempt on Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. The chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization since 2004, Abbas is also the Palestinian Authority president and the chairman of the Fatah Party, the rival to Hamas. During a meeting with Blinken, he pushed for a ceasefire, knowing that Blinken himself pushed Israeli Prime Minister for a humanitarian pause just days earlier. What he did not do is call for a war on Israel, something many Palestinians want him to do. Support for peaceful negotiations with Israel have been waning for some time, along with Abbas's popularity among Palestinians. In fact, he is deeply unpopular, mostly because Palestinians disagree with his tendency to favor a more peaceful approach with Israel than Hamas does. Back in September of 2021, 78% of Palestinians wanted Abbas to resign, according to a poll by the Palestinian Center for Policy Survey and Survey Research. 58% said they supported, quote, armed struggle against the Israelis, compared with only 20% who wanted some type of negotiated settlement and 24% who wanted peaceful resistance, whatever that is. That 58% supporting armed struggle has likely grown, especially with Hamas winning outright in the student elections in both major universities in the West Bank this last May. Whatever the number is now, they just tried to kill Abbas, a move that would certainly have moved the Palestinian Authority and Fatah even closer to Hamas. The Palestinian people are not as innocent as they may seem or as those on the left would have you believe. Solid majorities support killing Jews, and waves of them participated in the attack on October 7th. Remember that. They have been indoctrinated since birth and educated, often in schools funded by the UN, to believe that the Jewish people are their enemies and that Jewish lives have no value. They elected Hamas in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, and they just tried to kill the most moderate of their leaders, even though you really can't call Abbas moderate because Abbas supports the terrorists, just maybe not as publicly or as directly as many Palestinians would like. Are there Palestinians who want a peaceful resolution to the whole Arab-Israeli crisis? Well, yes. Are there innocent civilians among them? Yes. But are most of the Palestinians sympathetic to the Hamas terrorists? Yes. Do many Palestinians help the terrorists? Yes. If faced with the decision to help the terrorists or refuse, how many Palestinians would refuse? We don't know. And that is why the Palestinians, especially the ones in Gaza, where they elected Hamas, must be viewed with suspicion, especially when making decisions that affect the fate of the Israeli nation. Well, that puts Israel in a very tough spot. On the one hand, they must destroy Hamas, or risk that evil attacking them again and again and again, until the violence spirals into a nation-destroying frenzy that engulfs the entire Middle East. On the other hand, they are concerned about the actual innocents in Gaza. So what does Hamas do? They go out of their way to use every Gazan citizen as a human shield. Their vile hope is that more Gazans will die, innocent or not. And the more Gazans who die, innocent or not, the more international pressure they hope will build on Israel to stop civilian collateral damage. And that's exactly what is happening. So far, the heads of 18 major United Nations bodies, like the UN Human Rights Council and the World Health Organization, made a united call for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza as Israeli attacks become too effective for their taste. And President Biden asked Netanyahu for a humanitarian pause directly during a phone call on Monday. Biden has been building towards this. While he has repeatedly said that he supports Israel and that we need to stand by them, he keeps hedging the support by continually talking about the civilians in Gaza and how the Israelis need to protect them. Increasingly, he seems to be forgetting about the vitally important moral distinction between, on the one hand, Hamas, which intentionally targets innocent civilians, and Israel, which only targets valid military targets and goes to extreme lengths to avoid civilian collateral damage to the greatest extent possible. Not long ago, Biden made sure to say the U.S. wouldn't be drawing any red lines for Israel, that we wouldn't hold them back. Now, he is pushing for a pause, maybe up to 3 days, he said, or longer. How long until he demands a ceasefire? Well, not long, and Israel knows this. But so does Hamas. Hamas needs a ceasefire. Israel is mopping the floor with them. Hamas needs room to breathe, reorganize, and resupply. Enter the human shields. There was a reason that Hamas, about a week after the attack, had mosques broadcast messages over prayer speakers telling Gaza residents to stay in their homes and ignore Israeli calls for them to leave and move south. The IDF was building up for the expected ground offensive, and the Israeli military issued an evacuation warning to over 1 million people in the northern Gaza and Gaza City to head south before the operation started. Hamas wanted as many Gazan civilians to die as possible. More proof that the evil lurking within Hamas is especially sinister and needs to be stamped out immediately. Since then, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, Israel's chief military spokesman, has spoken out about how Hamas uses its own citizens as human shields. This is what he said, quote, Hamas has turned hospitals into command and control centers and hideouts for Hamas terrorists and commanders. Hamas terrorists operate inside and under Shifa Hospital and other hospitals in Gaza. The Israelis have backed up their claims with actual intelligence. Take a look at this video, which was released by the Israeli government. Okay, so here we see a picture of the tunnels. Basically, we're going to look at here under Shifa Hospital, and you can see that the tunnels are multi-layered, multiple levels of tunnels with rooms and command centers And then if we're taking now a look for the people listening on the audio podcast at Shifa Hospital, a map of Shifa Hospital from overhead, and you can see that in this dense area, there are many hospital sites, and then marked in red are entrances to the Hamas underground tunnel complex and other Hamas military and terrorist facilities that are close to things like the outpatient clinic and the maternity department, all mixed in, a convenience store. It's just absolutely despicable. Everyone knows that Hamas does these things, and they've been doing it for a long time, and it isn't just hospitals. The IDF has shown many examples of Hamas positioning equipment and supplies near children and near civilians. They place their rocket launchers near schools and UN buildings. Hamas is encouraging devastating collateral damage. Hamas wants children to die in Israeli air and missile strikes, and there are many, many more examples of this, so many that I wonder if any Hamas infrastructure or equipment isn't protected by, so-called protected by innocent human life. It is beyond sick, and anyone who is the least bit sympathetic towards Hamas is giving a thumbs up to this depravity. The Israelis understand the predicament. In an interview with ABC News' David Muir a few days ago, Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke on the matter. He said, quote, "I think every civilian lost is a tragedy. Every civilian life lost is a tragedy. We're fighting an enemy that is particularly brutal. They're using their civilians as human shields, and while we're asking the Palestinian civilian population to leave the war zone, they're preventing them at gunpoint. They're using them as human shields," close quote. Hamas is desperate for its own civilians to die, and they are dying. Several sources are citing figures near 10,000 deaths in the war. No one knows how accurate these figures are or how many of the civilians are actually Hamas fighters, supporters, or agents, but it's true that people are dying, that is for sure, and some of them are innocent children. But the fault for that lies with Hamas, not Israel. For Israel to give in and grant some type of ceasefire would be to encourage more of this human shield murder. They cannot let that strategy work. We cannot let that strategy work. Hamas and anyone else that might want to place civilians and rocket launchers in the same place must know that those decisions will not save the rocket launchers, will not save their efforts to perpetrate terror. Thank God that we have some very precise weapon systems. But for all our technology and all our attempts to limit civilian casualties, there will be mistakes and there will be misses. If Hamas wants its own civilians to die, well, unfortunately, then its own civilians will die. There's really nothing we can do about that except to destroy Hamas. We can also place the blame on those who deserve it and refuse to sit idly by and watch as it gets shifted to the Israelis. In other words, no ceasefire. We need this war to end as soon as possible with the destruction of Hamas. That's the best way to protect innocent lives. No matter how unpleasant and sad the videos and images from Gaza are, we need to remember that it was the evil that is Hamas that started this. It was Hamas who murdered 1,500 Israelis in cold blood, and it was Hamas who didn't blink as they beheaded babies, raped women, and burned people alive. Thankfully, the Israelis understand this and have resisted calls for a ceasefire. They have said there will be no ceasefire except for during the return of hostages. But the most important questions are, first, how long will they be able to hold out against international pressure? And second, how much pressure will Biden and his cronies apply? Those questions should have easy answers given what is happening to our own troops in the Middle East. Biden should resist and push against any and all calls for a ceasefire, and he should be denouncing anyone who does call for a ceasefire. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening. While our people, including Biden himself, have been pressuring Israel for a humanitarian pause, the terrorists and their Iranian backers have been working hard to attack U.S. military troops at their bases in the Middle East. There were 50, yes, you heard that right, 50 attacks on U.S. bases in the Middle East, mostly in Syria and Iraq, in the last month. Scores of our troops have been injured. There were 6 attacks in a 24-hour period earlier this week. The attacks, usually rocket or drone attacks, have increased in pace since President Biden authorized the pathetically weak 2-plane airstrike on an unoccupied arms cache owned by one of the Iranian-backed terror groups. We know the Iranians helped plan, fund, and execute the Hamas attack on Israel. We also know that without Iran and the support it gives, Hamas would be a hollow shell of what it is today. Iran, for all practical purposes, is just as culpable as Hamas when it comes to the horror experienced by Israelis on October 7th. And now, Iran is attacking our troops. When is Biden going to learn that the menace of Iran and the threat from Hamas, Hezbollah, and all the other foreign terrorist organizations that Iran supports are the same thing? They are all aiming at the same ultimate goal, the destruction of Israel and the destruction of the United States. The KISS principle applies here. Keep it simple, stupid. Calling for a ceasefire, or even a pause in the Israeli operations to destroy Hamas, sends a very powerful message to the mullahs over in Iran and their terrorist minions. It tells them that their increased aggression will go unchecked, and that they should take it to the next level. Go ahead, we won't stop you. All we are going to do is stop the ones who you want to destroy, all while you are trying to kill our own troops. Talk about pouring gasoline onto a fire. A ceasefire in Gaza would lead to more attacks on U.S. troops. Look, if a measly pinprick strike leads to the increase in attacks on our troops that we have just seen, with several attacks in 24 hours, what would a full-blown ceasefire bring about? The only thing that is going to stop the attacks on our troops, which are really part of the larger battle Iran is fighting against Israel and the U.S. in general, is decisive and violent action. History just demonstrates that that is the only thing that these evil dictators and terrorists understand. Some UN-supported ceasefire is the opposite of decisive action and will have the opposite result, more violence. So again, no ceasefire. But what about the innocent civilians, and what about the hostages? Well, during his phone call with President Biden, the Israeli prime minister said he was open to tactical little pauses to allow humanitarian aid in and hostages out. This is a very smart strategy, allowing for short pauses in military operations. We're talking about 4 hours, not days, will allow humanitarian aid into the civilians who need it without giving Hamas the time and space it needs to reorganize and refit. The Israelis can coordinate to have an aid convoy or aircraft group ready to go, pause their operations, send it in, and then continue once the delivery is complete. By the time Hamas will be able to do anything to capitalize on the pause, the Israelis will have their foot on the gas once again. As for the hostages, Hamas intends to trade them for resources. Just look what Biden gave Iran for 5 U.S. citizens, $6 billion. Hamas saw that and their mouths started watering. They already did their killing of civilians. These poor people were taken for a different purpose. This is not to say that they are safe, by no means, just that Hamas is going to wait until the last minute before executing them. That gives us time to get them out. Time we are wasting by not trying. Hamas thinks that if enough civilians die in Gaza, something they are actively contributing to, then the international community will rise and demand Israel to stop, demand a ceasefire. Then Hamas can begin ransoming off its hostages while remaining intact and start planning its next attack on Israel. In the end, Hamas will have succeeded in killing thousands of Israelis while destabilizing the Jewish state and making a profit to help fund the next wave. They know they have many friends and sympathizers out in the world, and they know that anti-Semitism is alive and well, particularly in Europe. Just look at the UN and 18 of its organizations that called for a ceasefire. So time seems to be on the terrorist side. A ceasefire fans the flames of that anti-Semitism. It gives those that hate Israel a victory. The terrorists will get away with their treachery. But if we don't do a ceasefire, Hamas will end up killing the hostages eventually, right? Well, here's the ugly and horrible truth. Hamas will likely kill those hostages anyways, unless they are ransomed for money and resources. Yes, Hamas may let 1 or 2 go here and there to entice more support and more pressure on Israel for a ceasefire. But the bulk of those hostages are either traded for ransom or are killed by Hamas, unless we rescue them. That is the only way they walk out alive without enriching Hamas in the process. And that is the only reason for Israel to really accept any kind of ceasefire. Only wouldn't be a ceasefire, just a pause to allow its special operators to conduct their rescue operations. But one could also make the argument that a special forces rescue operation would have a better chance of success without a ceasefire, in the midst of other military operations that cause chaos and distraction. So we are back to no ceasefire. And Hamas desperately needs a ceasefire, which is the main reason we cannot allow one. Israeli troops have pushed Palestinian militants back and cut Gaza in half while encircling Gaza City, Hamas's main stronghold. The IDF spokesperson said that Israeli forces, quote, are located right now in a ground operation in the depths of Gaza City and putting great pressure on Hamas. They have killed Hamas commanders and are disrupting the massive tunnel network Hamas uses to store and transport men and material. Thousands of Hamas fighters have been killed, and it is interesting to note the Gaza Ministry of Health does not distinguish between civilians and combatants in death tolls. Hamas's days as an effective terrorist force are numbered. They need a ceasefire to survive. The minute a ceasefire goes into effect, Hamas will find a way to smuggle all its trapped personnel out of Gaza City, saving a large bulk of their forces from destruction. They will focus on all the UN transported aid flowing to the civilians, seizing at least part of it with the help of loyal citizens and sympathetic and negligent UN personnel. Collectively, Hamas would be able to take a deep breath, reorganize its forces, reposition its equipment, and move the hostages. Outside help from the likes of Iran would filter into Gaza, and Hamas would begin planning its next moves, something it cannot do while it's fighting for its very survival. In a nutshell, Hamas is on the ropes, and the only thing that can save it is a ceasefire, which is why many of those supporting the Palestinians are crying for one. They do not want to see Hamas destroyed. The UN, the worldwide radical left, and even some in our government do not want to see Israel prevail over Hamas. This last week, Politico and others reported on a memo leaked from the State Department that is critical of Biden's support for Israel. He isn't doing much, but even that is too much for these mid and high-level staffers who wrote the memo. They do not want him to support Israel at all. Rather, they and all those supporting Palestinians focus on how Israel is occupying Palestine and must be driven off. Free Palestine, they say. One problem. All those protesters and Palestinian supporters don't understand that free Palestine really means destroy Israel. Or maybe they do, and they just agree wholeheartedly with that sentiment. It's scary. That would mean that they are okay with what Hamas has done. They are okay with beheading babies and all that horror. They are okay with taking U.S. civilians as hostages, with killing Americans. Have we forgotten that Hamas killed 33 Americans? Many of those supporting the Palestinians in this war do so under the guise of saving the civilians in Gaza. It's the humanitarian disaster they are against, they say. Well, that's not the real reason. If it was, they would be just as angry at Hamas as they are at Israel, because Hamas broke the fragile peace, slaughtered thousands of innocents by targeting them directly, and slaughtered thousands more by using them as human shields. But none of the protesters, the UN types calling for a ceasefire, the leftists screaming at Israel, none of them are upset with Hamas. Their anger is focused on Israel. They want Israel to stop defending itself. The staffers who wrote that State Department memo, the people at the UN, leftists calling for a ceasefire, and the protesters running around our country screaming at Israel, aren't supporting Palestine, whatever that is. They are really either supporting Hamas or demonizing Israel, or both. Support for Palestine, calling to free Palestine, is really just a cover for supporting Hamas and calling for the destruction of Israel. It's the same as saying Palestine from the river to the sea. It means pushing Israel into the sea, destroying it. It is anti-Semitism, plain and simple. It is evil. And for all the reasons I discussed in detail last week, most of which are quite obvious, we absolutely cannot allow Israel to be destroyed, period. So that brings us back to one very simple rule. There can be no ceasefire because it aids those who would see Israel wiped off the map forever. Even if Biden does not want to directly support Israel in this war, even though direct support is absolutely what we should be providing, Biden must at least stand firm against any calls for a ceasefire. So far, he has done so, and his party is fracturing over it. But he is wavering, asking Netanyahu directly for a humanitarian pause of several days early last week. And just this Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken warned Israel about reoccupying Gaza after the war with Hamas ends. He also insisted Hamas not rule Gaza because it would risk another October 7th attack. Biden and his people are trying to walk a tightrope. They want to support Israel to some extent while not angering their pro-Palestinian and thus pro-Hamas base too much. History has taught us that half measures and indecision lead to chaos and death. Biden is being indecisive and is trying to be on both sides of the conflict at the same time. He must choose. He must choose between freedom and human decency and life on the one hand, and fear, suffering, and death on the other. It is a choice between good and evil, between light and darkness. The people running around with signs supporting those that stand with terror have made their choice. Their hatred of Israel has blinded them to the abject horror their side has inflicted upon Israel and will inflict on the United States as well if they have their way. Those calling for a ceasefire while denying that Hamas is responsible for the humanitarian disaster unfolding in front of our eyes have made their choice. Biden must make his. He must fully side with Israel and help them usher the evil that is Hamas and Islamic extremism into the pages of history. His choice will do much in determining whether those pages tell a story full of light and life or one shrouded in darkness and covered with death. He must make the right choice. Well, that's all for today's show. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're watching this on Rumble or on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel, like the video. Doing those things helps us tremendously. And remember one more thing, the CCP must be destroyed.